A farmer noticed that his pig was obsessively digging in the same spot in the pen day after day. At first, he thought it was just the animal being capricious, but when he decided to take a shovel and dig deeper himself, he discovered something that had been hidden in the ground for decades, and what he saw turned his whole life upside down. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. The sun rose slowly over the distant hills, casting a pale light across the rolling fields that had belonged to the Marsh family for 3 generations. The farmhouse stood with its weathered boards and sagging porch, a place that carried both comfort and weariness in its timbers. Tobias Marsh had lived here nearly his whole life. He had been born in one of the upstairs rooms, raised in the shadow of his father's hard work and his grandfather's stern pride, and now in his middle years, the land and the animals were all he had left. His wife Ruth had passed nearly a decade ago, and his children had long since drifted away to cities, tired of the endless chores and the smell of livestock. That left Tobias alone to keep the farm alive. Though there were days when he wondered if the farm was keeping him alive instead, binding him to its routines the way a chain holds a man to an anchor. Every morning began the same. He rose before dawn, the chill of the wooden floor seeping into his feet as he dressed in worn denim and a flannel shirt patched in more places than he could count. Coffee was brewed on the old stove, its bitter steam filling the kitchen while the silence of the house pressed in on him. Once that silence had been filled with Ruth's humming, the sound of children's footsteps running down the hall, the slam of a door as his eldest shouted he would never work the farm another day. Now there was only the creak of his own boots and the occasional groan of the wind pushing against the window panes. The farm itself was a mixture of pride and fatigue. The barns leaned slightly, though they still stood strong enough to shelter the hay and tools. Fences lined the pastures, repaired so many times they were more patchwork than original wood. Horses grazed in the distance, their heads lifting whenever he crossed the yard, while chickens scratched near the porch, scattering at his approach. He knew each corner of the property, each rise and dip in the land, every stone that had once dulled a plow blade. His hands carried the map of this place in scars and calluses, but of all the animals he kept, it was the pigs that demanded the most of his attention. Hogs were temperamental creatures, clever in ways that often startled him, and stubborn enough to rival any mule. Among them was Chester, a massive boar with a broad back, a powerful snout, and eyes that seemed almost to understand more than they should. Tobias had raised pigs for over 20 years, and in that time he had never met one like Chester. There was something about the animal's gaze, steady and unblinking, that made a man feel as though he were being judged. Next to Chester was Dolly, a smaller, nervous sow who kept her distance when the larger hog grew restless. The two had shared a pen for nearly 2 years, yet Chester's dominance was unquestioned. Tobias had a routine when it came to the pigs. Each morning he carried their feed in heavy buckets, scattering grain and slop into the troughs while they pressed against the fence, grunting in anticipation. Most days Chester devoured his share with the same hunger as any other hog, but recently his habits had begun to change. Tobias noticed how Chester would leave food untouched, wandering instead to the far corner of the pen where the ground was harder, shaded by the fence posts. At first it seemed like nothing, a pig rooting in the dirt, searching for grubs or worms as they were inclined to do. But there was something strange about the way Chester worked that spot. He was not aimless in his digging, not turning over soil at random. He was precise, returning again and again to the same place, as though a hidden purpose drew him there. On that particular morning, Tobias leaned against the weathered fence with his coffee in hand, watching Chester snort and paw at the earth. The pig's massive body heaved with effort, and dirt sprayed in steady arcs as his snout pushed into the clay. Dolly had retreated to the opposite end of the pen, lying in the mud with her eyes half closed, unwilling to challenge Chester for space. The hog's skin was rubbed raw in places where stone and root had cut at him, yet still he worked with relentless energy. Tobias frowned. He had seen pigs root out truffles in old stories, but never had he witnessed one so consumed by the act of digging. Chester barely seemed to notice the world around him. At first Tobias tried to dismiss it. Animals had their peculiarities just as people did. A horse might favor one patch of grass, A hen might lay her eggs outside the nesting box. A dog might bark at shadows. Chester was, in his own way, simply a pig being a pig. Yet something about the persistence unsettled Tobias. Each time he refilled the hole with dirt and rocks, Chester would clear it again within hours, as if nothing could deter him. It was not hunger, for he ignored food. It was not comfort, for the hole was too narrow for him to wallow. It was purpose, and purpose in an animal could be more disturbing than any mindless instinct. The farm felt heavier with each passing day of Chester's obsession. Tobias began to notice how the other animals responded. The horses, grazing in the distant field, would lift their heads and stare toward the pen whenever Chester dug. The chickens quieted when he worked, their usual chatter dying away as if they too sensed something. Even the old sheepdog, once indifferent to the pigs, lingered near the fence with hackles raised, a low growl vibrating in his chest whenever Chester snorted deep into the earth. The air around that corner of the pen seemed different, charged, as if the ground itself held a secret it was reluctant to yield. For Tobias, the weight of the farm had always been one of routine, chores that began before sunrise and ended after dark, seasons measured in planting and harvest, animals born and slaughtered, endless cycles repeating until a man grew gray and tired. But Chester's strange digging disturbed that rhythm. It was a disruption, a ripple in the pond of his life that refused to fade. He told himself not to care, that pigs dug holes and it meant nothing. Yet every evening, as he sat on the porch with the last of his whiskey, he found his eyes drifting back toward the pen, where the faint silhouette of Chester could be seen even in twilight, his snout pressed to the earth like a miner tunneling for treasure. Tobias remembered something Ruth used to say, words that returned to him now with an edge of unease. She believed animals could sense things humans overlooked, storms before the clouds gathered, earthquakes before the ground trembled, sickness before symptoms showed. She had once insisted their old mare refused to enter the barn because she smelled death on his father days before he passed. Tobias had laughed at her then, dismissing it as superstition, but the memory lingered. Perhaps, he thought uneasily, Chester's obsession was not mere instinct. Perhaps the hog was sensing something buried where no man had reason to look. Still, Tobias was not a man given to fancies. His life was built on sweat, not stories, and he told himself he would not let a pig's antics unnerve him. Yet as the days lengthened into weeks, and Chester's determination only deepened, Tobias found himself avoiding the far corner of the pen, as though some part of him feared what might lie beneath. He tried to occupy his thoughts with other matters, the endless repairs, the thinning profits of the farm, the loneliness that clung to the evenings, but always his gaze drifted back to the hog, to the sound of earth being torn open again and again by relentless snout and hooves. That morning ended as many did. Tobias drained the last of his coffee, shook his head at Chester's strange behavior, and turned toward the house. Yet something lingered in his chest, a heaviness that no work could shake. The image of Chester digging, tireless and unwavering, was carved into his thoughts. He told himself he would not let it matter. He told himself he had lived too long and seen too much to be troubled by a pig. But deep inside, where reason could not quiet the whisper of unease, he felt the first stirrings of dread. Chester was not digging at random. Chester was searching, and though Tobias did not yet know what the hog was trying to find, a quiet, unshakable part of him already feared that whatever it was had been left in that soil for a reason. The following days unfolded with a sameness that at first reassured Tobias and then slowly unsettled him. For within that sameness lay the relentless ritual of Chester's digging. Each morning Tobias would cross the yard with his buckets of feed, the cool dawn clinging to his skin, and as soon as he reached the pen, he would see the familiar scene. Dolly, the smaller pig, waited with impatience at the trough, grunting and pacing, her eyes darting toward the approaching slop. Chester, however, stood in the corner, his massive body already coated with dust, his snout pressed to the soil like a man consumed by a single thought. He scarcely noticed the food at all. Once in a while he would pause, sniff the air, and glance at Tobias with eyes that seemed too steady for an animal, before lowering his head again and driving into the earth with renewed strength. It was as though the world had shrunk for him into a circle no larger than a cartwheel, and nothing outside it mattered. Tobias tried to scold him at first. He clapped his hands, banged the feed bucket against the fence, even tossed a few stones to startle him away. Chester would retreat a few steps, grunting in irritation, only to return as soon as Tobias turned his back. It was not the restless, distracted rooting of a pig following a fleeting scent. It was deliberate, focused, obsessive. By the third week, the hole had grown deep enough that Chester disappeared up to his shoulders when he stood inside it, his white hide stained brown with clay and mud, the raw patches on his snout deepening into wounds. Tobias found himself both frustrated and disturbed. This was no longer mischief. This was compulsion, and he could not shake the feeling that Chester was digging for something that mattered more than food, comfort, or rest. One evening, determined to end the nuisance, Tobias filled the hole himself. He shoveled dirt and rock into it until it was level with the rest of the pen, tamped it down with the flat of his spade, and then drove a series of heavy stakes into the ground. He fastened planks across them, building a barrier sturdy enough, he thought, to dissuade even the most stubborn hog. When he was done, he stood back, wiping sweat from his brow, and allowed himself the small satisfaction of a problem solved. But the next morning, when he returned with the feed, the planks lay splintered in the mud, and Chester was back in his corner, snout buried in soil, the hole deeper than before. The sight stopped Tobias cold. No animal he had ever owned had worked through wood that way, pushing and straining until the barrier gave way. It was as though the hog would destroy himself before abandoning his strange excavation. The persistence wore on Tobias in ways he did not at first understand. He began to dread the sound of hooves scraping at the earth, the rhythmic huff of breath that carried across the yard even into the house. At night, when he tried to rest, he would hear it in his dreams, the steady, measured digging, patient as a clock. Sometimes he woke to find that Chester had worked through the darkness, the hole larger than it had been at dusk. Dolly no longer approached that side of the pen at all. She lingered in the opposite corner, watching with nervous eyes as if she too sensed something uncanny about Chester's obsession. The dog refused to go near the pen, and the chickens scattered whenever Chester snorted too loudly. Even the horses, usually indifferent to the pigs, seemed uneasy. Tobias would glance across the fields and see them gathered near the fence line, all facing toward the pen, their ears pricked and their bodies stiff, as though waiting for some revelation to emerge from the ground. The change in Chester's appetite troubled him most. A pig that does not eat is a pig in decline. Yet Chester seemed to thrive despite ignoring most of his food. He would gulp down a few mouthfuls at dawn, enough to sustain his bulk, and then turn away to resume his work. His body remained strong, his shoulders thick with muscle, his movements tireless. Tobias had raised pigs long enough to know that hunger, thirst, and exhaustion eventually stopped them. But Chester pressed on, as if the usual needs of the flesh no longer bound him. It was this unnatural endurance that unnerved Tobias most of all. He caught himself more than once, standing at the fence for long minutes just watching, his mind caught between awe and fear. Chester's hooves scraped the soil with an orderliness that no farmer could mistake. He was not digging to burrow or wallow. He was excavating. The farm itself began to feel altered. Tobias could not explain how or why, but the corner of the pen where Chester dug carried a weight that seemed to spread outward. When he crossed the yard, his eyes were drawn there first. When he sat on the porch, sipping whiskey as dusk fell, the sound of Chester's snorts seemed louder than the chorus of frogs by the pond or the rustle of wind in the cottonwoods. He found himself avoiding visitors, worried they would ask about the damage to the pen or hear the ceaseless digging and laugh at him for letting an animal control his peace of mind. More than once he thought of selling Chester at auction, yet whenever the idea took root, a strange reluctance rose to smother it. Something told him the hog must stay, that to rid himself of Chester would be to abandon some unfinished business, though he could not name what business that might be. In quieter moments, Tobias remembered Ruth's voice, that gentle, steady tone that used to guide him when he was younger and more uncertain. She had spoken often of animals sensing things humans could not, and though he had dismissed it then, he could not dismiss the memory of her certainty now. He pictured her watching Chester with that half-smile she wore when she believed she was right about something, and he felt a pang of loss so sharp it brought tears to his eyes. Ruth would have told him to pay attention, to see in Chester's persistence not nuisance, but message. And perhaps that was what troubled him most, the suspicion that he was ignoring something important, something his wife would have understood. One afternoon, as Tobias leaned against the fence post and watched Chester dig, he realized how much the hog's behavior mirrored something human. The rhythm of the snout pressing into earth, the pause to listen, the way Chester adjusted his angle and redoubled his effort, it looked like the work of a man guided by memory or intent, not instinct. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He thought of miners he had seen in photographs, their faces set with grim determination as they chipped away at stone, searching for veins of gold. Chester bore that same grim determination, as though nothing short of death would stop him. Tobias found himself shivering despite the warmth of the sun. As the days stretched into another week, Tobias began to feel the weight of the digging pressing on his own spirit. He tried to occupy himself with chores, the mending of fences, the cleaning of the barn, the endless tending of crops, but always he returned to the pen. His eyes followed Chester's progress as though against his will. The hole grew deeper, the sides worn smooth by the hog's body, the bottom packed hard from constant trampling. Tobias caught himself wondering how far Chester would go, how deep he would dig if left unchecked. He imagined the hog tunneling all the way to the center of the earth, chasing some invisible scent only he could perceive. One evening, after refilling the trough and watching Dolly eat alone while Chester labored in his hole, Tobias felt a sudden wave of helplessness. He rested his arms on the fence and whispered under his breath, asking the empty air what it was that Chester sought. He half expected the hog to pause, to lift his head and answer in some incomprehensible way. But Chester did not stop. The steady scrape of hooves and snout filled the twilight, as if to remind Tobias that answers would come only from the soil itself. With a sigh, the farmer turned back toward the house, the weight of unease pressing heavier with each step. He had lived long enough to know when something was out of joint, when the ordinary had tipped into the extraordinary. Chester's persistence was not the quirk of an animal. It was a sign. And though Tobias tried to bury the thought as surely as he buried the hole each day, he knew in his heart that the truth would not stay hidden forever. The nights grew longer, though summer still held the land in its warm embrace, and Tobias found himself waking more often in the small hours when the world outside the farmhouse seemed unnaturally alive. He would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening past the creaks of the house settling and the soft tick of the old clock in the hallway. Beneath it all came another sound, faint yet insistent, a steady rhythm that pulled at his nerves like water dripping in a cave. At first he thought it was a dream or the echo of his own heartbeat, but when he rose and stepped to the window, pushing aside the curtain, he could see the shadow moving in the pen. Even under the cold light of the moon, Chester's shape was unmistakable, his massive body bent forward, his snout working tirelessly at the earth. The sound carried clearly through the still night, the scrape of hooves, the snort of breath, the rustle of loosened soil. It was relentless, and in the strange silence of midnight it seemed louder than any storm. The first time Tobias went out to confront him, the cool night air bit through his shirt, and the smell of damp soil rose from the ground as if the earth itself was unsettled. He stood at the fence, hands gripping the rough wood, and called to the hog in a low, weary voice. Chester paused, lifting his head, his eyes reflecting pale moonlight. For a heartbeat they stared at each other, man and beast, until Tobias felt something twist in his stomach. There was an intelligence in that gaze, something steady and purposeful. Then Chester snorted, turned back, and pressed his snout into the ground again, with even more determination than before. Tobias stood there a long time, the night pressing heavy on his shoulders, before retreating to the house with the uneasy knowledge that nothing he did would stop the animal. In the days that followed, the farm's rhythms seemed to shift around Chester's obsession. Tobias noticed how the other animals reacted, though he tried at first to dismiss it as coincidence. The sheepdog, once content to nap in the shade of the barn, now prowled restlessly near the fence line, growling low whenever Chester's digging grew too frantic. The chickens, usually noisy and quarrelsome, quieted whenever they wandered too close to that corner of the pen. Even the horses seemed to feel it. Tobias would glance across the pasture and find them gathered together, their heads all turned toward the pig pen as if drawn by some invisible cord. They did not approach, but they did not look away either, and their unease bled into him until he could no longer tell if it was theirs or his own. The hole itself was no longer just a blemish on the yard, but a wound on the land. Tobias could see how the soil there was different, how it crumbled under his boots when he stepped inside to refill it. The rest of the farm was hard-packed clay, stubborn and dry from years of sun. Yet here the earth gave way too easily, as though it had once been disturbed and never fully settled again. When his spade sank deeper than it should have, he felt a cold trickle of doubt in his chest. He stood there, shovel in hand, sweat running down his back, and thought, "Someone has dug here before." The thought lodged in his mind like a burr. He tried to shake it away, telling himself he was imagining things, letting superstition take root in a brain too tired for reason. But every evening, as he watched Chester methodically enlarge the hole, the certainty grew stronger. This was not just an animal's fancy. This was a place the earth itself was trying to give up, and Chester was only its messenger. As the days passed, Tobias began to notice how his own behavior was changing. He lingered near the pen more often, leaning on the fence with his arms folded, watching Chester work with the fascination of a man who both fears and longs to know what lies beneath. Sometimes he crouched and ran his hand along the edges of the hole, feeling the difference in the soil, the unnatural looseness. Each time his pulse quickened and his throat grew dry. He told himself to stop, to leave it alone, but his feet kept carrying him back, as though drawn by the same magnet that guided the hog. At night, the unease followed him into his sleep. Dreams came fitful and dark, full of muffled noises and shifting earth, of voices buried deep calling faintly through the soil. He would wake drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, and listen to the scrape of Chester's hooves outside. Once he thought he heard something else, a sound not animal at all but low and mournful, like a sigh or a whisper carried on the wind. He sat upright in bed, his mouth dry, straining to hear. The sound faded, but the impression lingered, and he could not shake the certainty that Chester was not alone in his work. The farm itself began to feel different, as if its spirit had changed. Tobias had always known his land to be stubborn, unyielding, but steady, like an old ox that could be trusted to pull as long as it was fed. Now it felt restless, unsettled, the air thicker, the shadows longer. When he walked across the yard, he sometimes caught himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone there. The barn creaked more at night. The wind moaned through the eaves, and the silence between those sounds grew oppressive. It was not just Chester that kept him awake anymore. It was the sense that something unseen moved beneath the skin of the farm, waiting. His mind drifted more often to Ruth in those days. He remembered how she had once insisted that their old mare knew death was coming for his father before anyone else did, refusing to step inside the barn where the man lay sick. He had laughed at her then, but the memory returned now with cruel weight. What if Chester was like that mare? What if the hog's obsession was not madness but instinct, an awareness that something hidden, something wrong, lay beneath the soil? The idea filled Tobias with dread, because if it were true, then the farm he thought he knew held secrets darker than he ever imagined. One afternoon, he knelt by the hole after Chester had tired himself out and gone to rest. The soil was cool and damp under his fingers, strangely loose unlike the rest of the yard. He pressed his hand deeper, and the earth gave way too easily, crumbling like ash. He pulled back, shaking his head, trying to dismiss the thought, but it clung to him. The land had been disturbed here once. Someone had broken it open and closed it again, leaving only this restless animal to uncover it. He wiped his hands on his trousers and stood, his gaze following Chester as the hog stirred, snorted, and lumbered back to the hole, as though unwilling to let it rest even for an hour. The certainty grew inside him, a quiet voice he could no longer ignore. There was something down there. He did not know what, and he was not sure he wanted to know, but Chester did. That realization chilled him more than any cold wind could. The hog was no longer just an animal digging idly in the dirt. He was a guide, a sentinel, pointing again and again to a secret that the land had tried to swallow. Tobias walked back toward the house with heavy steps, his heart pounding as though he had glimpsed the edge of a truth too large to face. He told himself he would not return to the pen that night, that he would pour himself a drink and forget. But deep down in the quiet corners of his mind, he already knew he would be back before long, shovel in hand, unable to resist the call of the soil Chester refused to leave alone. By the time the next week arrived, Tobias no longer tried to pretend that Chester's digging was nothing more than the nuisance of a restless hog. It had become a weight pressing on his shoulders, a constant presence in his thoughts, whether he was mending fences, hauling water, or sitting at his kitchen table staring at the same old knot in the wood. The farm, which once offered him the small comfort of routine, now seemed like a stage where something hidden and ominous was struggling to make itself known. Even the air around the pig pen felt changed, heavier, as if each breath carried with it the scent of damp earth and some unspoken truth waiting to break the surface. That morning the sun had risen through a thin veil of mist, painting the fields in muted shades of gray. Tobias crossed the yard with his feed buckets, his boots dragging through dew-wet grass. He felt tired down to his bones, not just with the labor of the farm, but with the gnawing unrest that Chester had planted in him. As he approached the pen, he braced himself for the familiar sight, and indeed there was Chester, his massive frame hunched in the corner, shoulders straining as he pushed his snout deeper into the ground. But something was different. The hog was not merely digging, he was making a sound Tobias had never heard before. It was low, drawn out, almost like a moan. It quivered in the air and seemed to carry sorrow rather than exertion. Tobias froze, the feed buckets heavy in his hands, his heart stumbling in his chest. Animals made noise in all manner of ways, but this sound carried something that felt unmistakably mournful, almost human. Chester paused, lifted his head, and fixed Tobias with a gaze so intent that the farmer felt stripped bare. The sound came again, rising from deep in the hog's chest, vibrating through the air like a plea. For a moment Tobias thought of Ruth, her voice in his memory telling him that animals sensed what humans could not. He shuddered, setting the buckets down slowly, as though any sudden movement might break the strange spell. He wanted to turn and walk away, to leave the hog to his madness, but his feet carried him closer to the fence instead. Chester stood still, his eyes locked on him, before nudging his snout toward the ground, as if urging him onward. Tobias's hand gripped the top rail until his knuckles whitened. It was as though the animal was calling him into the secret it had been working to unearth. For the first time, Tobias understood that this was no simple digging. Chester had been waiting for him to listen, to follow, to take up the task himself. The hog could dig forever, but the truth was meant for human eyes. That evening, after the chores were done, and the farm lay under the hush of twilight, Tobias returned to the pen with a shovel resting on his shoulder. His steps were unsteady, his stomach tight with unease, yet he could not stop himself. He felt as though he were answering a summons. Chester waited at the edge of the hole, silent now, his body tense but still. When Tobias climbed inside, the hog backed away, watching him with an intensity that felt like approval. Tobias knelt, ran his hand along the walls, and felt again that unnatural looseness of the soil. His breath caught. He pressed the shovel into the bottom, and it sank far too easily, the blade sliding down into earth that should have resisted. He lifted a spadeful of soil and tossed it aside, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Chester gave a short grunt, almost encouraging, and Tobias dug again. The hole deepened under his effort, each scoop of soil amplifying the tension coiled in his chest. The ground was darker here, richer, unlike the pale clay he knew so well. He dug slowly, carefully, as though afraid of what might come next, yet unable to stop. Sweat ran down his back, soaking his shirt, but he scarcely noticed. Chester paced above him, restless but patient, his shadow stretching long in the fading light. The farm around them had grown silent, even the crickets withholding their usual chorus, as if the entire world had paused to witness what he was about to uncover. At last the shovel struck something that was not rock, not root, not soil. The sound was muffled but distinct, a dull thud that reverberated up the handle into his hands. Tobias froze, his breath caught in his throat, then knelt lower and brushed away the dirt with his fingers. The earth crumbled to reveal fabric, faded and stiff with age. His heart hammered as he cleared more of it, the outline of a sleeve emerging beneath his trembling hands. It was a piece of clothing, buried deep where no plow or storm could have placed it. He sat back on his heels, chest heaving, staring at the scrap of blue cloth that should not have been there. For a long moment he could not move. His mind swirled with half-formed thoughts, memories of family, of the farm's long history, of Ruth's voice warning him not to ignore the signs. The air seemed heavier, pressing against his skin, as though the farm itself had been holding its breath. Chester gave a soft snort and leaned closer, his eyes never leaving Tobias's face. It was as if the hog knew, had always known, what lay hidden in the soil. Tobias forced himself to dig further, his hands trembling, his breath shallow. The soil fell away to reveal more cloth, then something smooth and curved beneath it. His stomach lurched as he recognized the unmistakable arc of bone. He jerked back, scrambling to his feet, his mind a storm of disbelief and horror. But the truth was undeniable. Chester had not been digging for food or comfort. He had been unearthing a secret long buried, a secret that someone had wanted hidden forever. The farmer stood at the edge of the hole, sweat and dirt streaking his face, the shovel limp in his hand. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might break his ribs. Chester climbed closer, lowering his massive head until his snout brushed Tobias's arm in a gesture almost like reassurance. The hog's mournful sound rose again, softer this time, but it pierced Tobias deeper than any shout. It was grief. It was insistence. It was the weight of something demanding to be seen. Tobias staggered out of the hole and leaned against the fence, his body trembling. He felt the farm around him differently now. Every fence post, every plank of the barn, every acre of soil seemed tainted, built on a foundation of silence and secrets. He had not yet uncovered the full truth, but he knew beyond doubt that this land carried a burden far older than his own lifetime. Chester had shown him the way, and now he had no choice but to follow it further. That night, as he sat at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, Tobias stared at the darkened window and listened to the quiet outside. He knew Chester would not sleep. The hog would keep his vigil, waiting, urging, demanding. The sound of that mournful cry echoed in Tobias's ears, refusing to fade. He knew he could no longer fill the hole and walk away. Something lay beneath his land, something his family had lived on top of for generations, and it was calling to him through the persistence of a pig. He had crossed a line when he put the shovel into the ground, and there would be no going back. In the small hours of the night, when he finally rose to go to bed, Tobias caught his reflection in the glass of the window. His face looked older, drawn and hollow, as though the farm itself had aged him overnight. He thought of his grandfather, his father, the men whose sweat and blood had shaped this land before him. Had they known? Had they placed him on soil that carried such a secret? The questions pressed down heavier than the silence. He turned away, his shoulders bowed, knowing that tomorrow he would return to the hole, not because he wanted to, but because Chester would still be there, waiting, and because the truth no longer allowed him to rest. The morning broke pale and brittle, the light seeping slowly over the hills as if reluctant to reveal another day. Tobias had not slept. He had tossed and turned in his narrow bed, haunted by the memory of what his shovel had touched in the soil. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the strip of faded fabric and the arc of bone gleaming faintly in the dirt. When he did drift into a shallow doze, he dreamed of Chester's eyes fixed on him with silent insistence, and of that mournful sound echoing across the farm like a funeral hymn. By the time dawn crept through the curtains, he felt hollow, his nerves raw. He rose without appetite, poured himself a cup of coffee he did not drink, and found his boots already by the door, as if his body had made the decision for him while his mind still quailed. Outside, the farm lay in a deceptive peace. The chickens pecked quietly in the yard, the horses moved like shadows at the far fence, and the dog dozed with his head on his paws but his ears pricked, listening. Only the pig pen held its strange intensity. Chester stood there, silent now, his bulk poised at the edge of the hole. He did not dig. He only watched, waiting. Tobias felt the weight of that gaze on him as he crossed the yard. It was no longer the look of an animal at all, but of something older, something that demanded reckoning. He climbed into the pen, shovel in hand, his breath shallow, and descended once more into the hole. The earth yielded quickly beneath him. He dug carefully, his hands trembling as he pushed the soil aside, afraid of what more he would uncover, and yet compelled to see. The fabric spread wider, revealing the outline of clothing, a shirt or jacket, its color dulled to a ghost of blue. He brushed the dirt away with shaking fingers until the unmistakable curve of a rib bone glimmered through. He froze, his stomach tightening, his breath trapped in his chest. He had known in some deep and fearful way that he would find this, but knowing did not soften the blow. These were human remains, hidden beneath his land, beneath the very ground that had fed and sheltered his family for 3 generations. He forced himself to keep working, though every instinct screamed to stop. The more he uncovered, the clearer the form became, a skeleton lying on its side, the bones arranged in a posture that suggested deliberate placement rather than accident. This was no grave marked with care, no resting place blessed by words or ceremony. This was concealment. Someone had placed this body here with intent to hide it, to erase it from memory. Tobias sat back on his heels, sweat stinging his eyes, his chest rising and falling with the force of his breath. Around the remains lay objects that had endured time more stubbornly than flesh. A leather belt, stiff and cracked but still recognizable, circled the waist. Boots, their soles worn, their leather dulled, clung to the bones of the feet. Tobias lifted them gently, brushing away soil, and then his hand closed around something that made his blood run cold. It was a small metal star, tarnished with age but unmistakable. A badge. He turned it in his palm, and though the years had darkened the metal, the engraving was still legible. Sheriff Marcus Webb. The date struck him like a hammer, 1923. Tobias's hands shook so badly that he nearly dropped it. His heart pounded, his thoughts a frantic whirl of disbelief and dread. Sheriff, a man of the law. Murdered, buried in secret on marshland, hidden beneath the soil where pigs now rooted and wallowed. Tobias staggered upright, clutching the badge, and stared at Chester. The hog stood at the edge of the hole, silent and steady, his eyes locked on the farmer's face. In that gaze, Tobias read something beyond comprehension, a knowledge that chilled him to the bone. Chester had known. From the beginning, he had known. The farm around him seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind was still, the leaves unmoving, the horses frozen at the fence. Tobias felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. His grandfather had built this farm. His father had expanded it, and he had inherited it, never questioning the soil beneath his feet. But now that soil revealed a truth he could not escape. A lawman had been murdered and hidden here, his bones sleeping under the earth while marsh hands built fences, planted fields, and raised children above him. The thought turned Tobias's stomach. He felt suddenly tainted, his bloodline sullied by a crime older than his birth, but still alive in the land that sustained him. Chester shifted, giving a soft grunt that snapped Tobias from his spiraling thoughts. He looked back down at the skeleton, at the blue fabric clinging stubbornly to bone, at the badge in his hand that gleamed even in tarnish. Questions battered his mind with relentless force. Who had killed Marcus Webb? Why had he been buried here? Had his grandfather known? Had his father? And why had no one ever spoken of it? The silence of his ancestors loomed like a shadow over him, and he realized with horror that the truth had been buried not only in the soil, but in the very stories that had been told and left untold in his family. He climbed out of the hole on unsteady legs, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He stumbled to the fence and leaned against it, the badge clutched so tightly in his fist that the metal cut into his skin. Chester followed him with his gaze, stepping closer until his snout brushed Tobias's sleeve. It was a gesture that felt like both comfort and demand, as though the hog were telling him, "Now you know, and now you must act." Tobias could not bear the weight of it. He staggered away, crossing the yard to the house with the badge burning in his palm like a brand. Inside, the kitchen felt colder than it ever had. He set the badge on the table and stared at it, his heart still hammering. The tarnished star seemed to pulse with meaning, a symbol of justice silenced for a century. He pulled out the old photo albums Ruth had insisted on keeping, thumbing through pages yellowed with time. Faces stared back at him from the past, unsmiling men in work shirts, stern women in calico dresses. Then his hand stilled on a photograph dated 1923. His grandfather Jonas stood beside the original farmhouse, his father Samuel at his side. With them were two other men. One was tall and lean, his face sharp, his eyes intense. Tobias studied the image, his pulse quickening. The man wore a shirt so similar to the one he had just unearthed that Tobias felt the room tilt. On the back of the photo, written faintly in pencil, were names: Jonas Marsh, Samuel Marsh, Marcus Webb, Theodore Pike. The name struck him with cruel clarity. Marcus Webb, the sheriff whose badge now sat on his table. The man in the photograph was the man whose bones lay in Chester's hole, and he had been standing with Jonas and Samuel, smiling for the camera as if nothing were amiss. Tobias felt his breath falter. His grandfather had known him. His father had known him. They had stood together for a picture, and yet Webb's body had ended up buried on their land. The weight of that knowledge threatened to crush him. He poured himself whiskey with shaking hands, but the burn did nothing to steady him. He sat at the table with the badge and the photograph side by side, the truth of it pressing down like a millstone. His grandfather had been involved, perhaps his father too. The land he had cherished all his life, the inheritance he had thought clean and honest, was stained with blood. Night fell heavy over the farm, the shadows deep and still. Tobias sat long into the darkness, staring at the badge, the photograph, the empty glass. Chester remained outside, keeping vigil by the hole, as if unwilling to let the secret sink back into silence. When Tobias finally dragged himself to bed, his mind was a storm of questions without answers. But one thing was certain. The farm was not what he thought it was. His family was not what he thought they were. And the truth, now unearthed, would not be buried again. The night after he found the badge stretched on endlessly, every tick of the old hallway clock grinding against Tobias's nerves. Sleep refused him, and though his body ached from the digging, his mind would not surrender to rest. He lay in the dark with the photograph balanced on his chest and the tarnished star on the nightstand, both of them glowing faintly in the dim spill of moonlight through the curtains. He felt as though he had welcomed intruders into his home, unwanted guests that sat silently in the corners, watching him, waiting for him to acknowledge the truth they carried. The farm, his own flesh and blood, and everything he had built seemed altered now, made fragile by the weight of what he had unearthed. When dawn finally came, he rose with the heaviness of an old man, though he was not yet 50. The kitchen greeted him with its familiar emptiness, but he saw it differently now. The worn table where Ruth used to set breakfast, the shelf where she had kept her recipe cards, the chair where his father had once sat and shared stories about the hard winters. All of it seemed like scenery arranged to hide the darker play that had always been performed beneath. Tobias poured himself coffee, though his hands shook so badly that he spilled half of it across the counter. He glanced toward the window, where Chester's hulking form was visible in the pen, standing guard over the hole. The hog did not move except to breathe, his eyes fixed on the earth as though it still held something worth guarding. Tobias looked away quickly, unable to meet that steady gaze. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of grim determination. He brought down boxes from the attic, brushed the dust from trunks that had not been opened in years, and spread documents and ledgers across the kitchen table until the room looked like the workspace of a man searching for something lost. Old property deeds, yellowed birth certificates, receipts, and journals lay scattered in piles. He did not know what he was searching for exactly. Some mention of Marcus Webb, perhaps, or a clue that would tell him how his family had been entangled in the sheriff's fate. What he found instead was silence, a silence that screamed louder than any confession. The journals of his grandfather Jonas were thin on detail, his entries curt, concerned only with livestock counts and the weather. Yet Tobias noticed gaps, There were stretches of days, even weeks, when no entry was made, only to resume suddenly with words about expansion, new land acquired, new opportunities seized. One journal in particular from the fall of 1923 caught his eye. The handwriting was hurried, jagged, not the steady hand of Jonas's earlier years. The entry dated September 15th read, "The Webb matter is settled. We can move forward now." Beneath it, 3 days later, Jonas wrote that he had purchased the Morrison plot, doubling the size of the ranch. Tobias read those lines over and over until the words blurred. The Webb matter is settled. The phrase sank into him like a stone into water. His stomach churned, his throat closed, and he nearly tore the page from the book, but he forced himself to steady his hand. Here it was, the link between the bones in the ground and the family that had walked this land with pride. His grandfather had written it himself, a casual phrase hiding a crime that echoed a century later. Tobias pushed away from the table and staggered outside, needing air, needing distance from the suffocating walls of the house. The morning sun glared off the fields, but the brightness only sharpened the shadows in his mind. He walked to the pen, where Chester watched him with unblinking eyes. The hog had stopped digging days ago, as though his work were done. He simply stood by the hole, keeping vigil, his bulk a silent reminder of what had been uncovered. Tobias leaned against the fence, his head bowed, and whispered words that dissolved into the wind. He asked questions that no one could answer. Why had they done it? How could they have lived with it? And what was he meant to do now? The unwilling heir to their silence? The farm did not answer, but its silence pressed harder on him. Every fence post, every stone wall, every timber in the barn seemed tainted now, soaked in guilt. He thought of Ruth again, her firm belief in justice, her unyielding sense of right and wrong. She would have told him there was no choice but to bring the truth into the light, no matter the cost. But Ruth was gone, and the cost would be his alone to bear. To expose what he had found would mean tearing down the name his family had built, a name that still carried respect in town, a name carved into plaques and stitched into the county's history. He imagined the whispers in the feed store, the looks of disgust at church, the neighbors crossing the street to avoid him. He imagined his children, long estranged, reading in some distant newspaper that their father had exposed their great-grandfather as a murderer. Would they see it as courage or betrayal? Yet silence was no easier. To bury the badge again, to fill in the hole and pretend nothing had happened, would be to become complicit. The bones would not vanish from his mind. The phrase in Jonas's journal would not fade from memory. He would wake each day and walk the land, knowing that beneath his boots lay the remains of a man who had died seeking justice. The farm would never feel like home again. It would feel like a graveyard. For days he wrestled with the choice, his mind swinging between resolve and fear. He carried the badge in his pocket, its weight a constant reminder, and at night he spread the documents across the table, trying to convince himself that he had misunderstood, that there was another explanation. But the evidence was too stark. His grandfather had known Marcus Webb. His grandfather had profited from Webb's disappearance, and his grandfather had left behind a farm built on blood. The animals sensed his turmoil. The dog refused to leave his side, watching him with worried eyes. The horses clustered together in the pasture, uneasy and restless. Even Dolly, timid and nervous, pressed closer to Chester as though seeking comfort. Chester himself had grown quiet, his digging done, his mission fulfilled. But he followed Tobias's every move, shadowing him from the pen with eyes that seemed to demand an answer. At last one evening, Tobias returned to the hole and knelt beside it once more. The skeleton lay there in the deepening dusk, half exposed, the bones pale against the dark soil. The sheriff's badge glimmered faintly in his hand, and he held it out over the grave as though offering it back. He whispered an apology he did not fully understand, words carried away on the night air. Chester stepped closer, lowering his head until his snout brushed Tobias's shoulder. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and in that moment Tobias felt the enormity of what had been asked of him. The truth was no longer just a choice, it was a burden placed on him, passed through time, unearthed by a pig, but meant for him to carry. He rose slowly, his body heavy, but his mind steadier than it had been in days. The shadow of the past stretched long across the farm, dark and terrible. But it was his shadow now, and he could not step out of it by turning away. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would decide. Tomorrow he would act. The silence had lasted a century, but it could not last forever. And as he walked back toward the house, the hog followed him with solemn steps, as though to remind him that some truths, once brought to the surface, refused to be buried again. The house was silent, but for the ticking of the clock on the wall, each beat louder than the last, echoing like a hammer in Tobias's ears. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around the tarnished badge, the photograph of his grandfather and the sheriff lying beside it. The journals lay open, their yellowed pages whispering secrets into the dim room. The whiskey glass at his elbow had gone warm and untouched, the amber liquid quivering whenever his hand shook. He had spent days wrestling with the shadow of his family's past, and now the silence in the room pressed down so heavily, he felt as if the walls themselves were waiting for him to decide. Outside, the farm held its own vigil. Chester stood motionless in the pen, guarding the hole with the patience of a sentinel carved in stone. Dolly lingered in the far corner, restless and uneasy, while the horses clustered at the fence as if they too were drawn to the weight of what lay beneath the soil. The air had changed in these days, thick with expectation, as though the earth itself demanded a reckoning. Tobias felt it in his bones, in the tightness of his chest, in the way his hands trembled when he tried to work. Every board of the barn, every nail in the fence, every patch of soil seemed to whisper the same question. What will you do? He rose from the table at last, his legs stiff, his mind heavy with indecision. The badge lay cold in his palm, heavier than any tool he had ever carried. He stepped outside, the late evening sun painting the fields in long, bleeding shadows. The air was still, the kind of stillness that came before a storm. His boots carried him toward the pen without thought, drawn by a force older than his will. Chester lifted his head as he approached, his eyes fixed on him with a steady intensity that felt like judgment. Tobias leaned on the fence, staring down into the hole where the skeleton lay, its bones pale against the dark soil, the fabric of its shirt still clinging stubbornly, the echo of a life cut short whispering from the earth. He thought of Ruth then, her voice so clear in his memory that for a moment he almost turned, expecting to see her standing beside him. She would not have hesitated. She would have told him that justice mattered more than legacy, that silence in the face of wrong was a crime of its own. He could hear her steady voice telling him that the truth, no matter how painful, had to be carried into the light. And yet, when he thought of the Marsh name, of his grandfather's stern face in photographs, of the generations that had labored and bled to build this farm, his heart clenched. To expose the truth was to burn that legacy to ash, to strip his family of its standing, to turn his own name into a curse whispered by neighbors and descendants alike. He closed his eyes, his thoughts a storm. If he buried the bones again, if he burned the journals and threw the badge into the river, no one would ever know. The sheriff's disappearance was a century-old mystery, long abandoned by time. There would be no reckoning if he chose silence. The farm would remain his, and the world would go on, unaware of the secret beneath his land. But every time he imagined filling in the hole, every time he pictured the soil closing again over those bones, he felt his stomach twist. He saw Chester's eyes, heard that mournful cry, felt the weight of the badge pressing into his palm. Silence might save his legacy, but it would damn his soul. The sky darkened, the first stars pricking the horizon. Tobias stood by the fence, caught between past and future, between loyalty and justice. Chester stepped closer, pressing his massive head against the wood, the gesture almost like a plea. Tobias reached out without thinking, his hand resting on the rough bristles of the hog's head, and felt a shiver run through him. It was as though the animal was telling him that the choice was his alone, but that the cost of silence would be heavier than the cost of truth. He climbed into the pen, moving slowly, his body heavy with the gravity of the moment. He descended into the hole and knelt beside the bones, the badge gleaming faintly in his hand. He placed it gently on the rib cage, his fingers lingering on the cold metal, and whispered words he had never imagined speaking. You will not be forgotten." Chester snorted softly as if in answer, and Tobias felt tears sting his eyes. He rose, his chest trembling, and looked toward the house. He knew what he had to do. The weight of his family's silence could no longer hold him, but even as the resolve settled in him, fear gnawed at the edges. He imagined walking into the sheriff's office, laying the badge on the desk, telling them what he had found. He imagined the faces of the townsfolk when the story spread, the scandal, the whispers, the shame. His farm, his life, his very name would be torn apart. He would be remembered not as a farmer who kept his land, but as the man who destroyed his family's reputation. And yet, he thought, perhaps that was the only way to free himself from the weight of the past. Perhaps the farm, the land, the Marsh name were never truly his to preserve. Perhaps they belonged to the truth. Night fell fully now, the stars bright in the black sky. Tobias climbed out of the hole, his decision etched in the set of his shoulders, though his heart still quaked. Chester followed him to the edge of the pen, silent and watchful, his eyes gleaming in the starlight. Tobias paused, his hand resting on the fence, and turned back for one last look at the bones. The earth would hold them a little longer, but not forever. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would go into town. Tomorrow he would carry the badge and the journals and the photograph to those who could not look away. Tomorrow he would break the silence. As he walked back to the house, the weight in his chest shifted. It was still heavy, but it was no longer the weight of indecision. It was the weight of burden accepted, of truth chosen. He entered the kitchen, gathered the documents into a bundle, and set the badge atop them. He did not drink the whiskey this time. He sat in the stillness, his head bowed, and let the night hold him. Outside, Chester lay down at the edge of the porch, his massive head resting on his hooves, his eyes never leaving Tobias. It was as though the hog understood that the battle was over, that the farmer had chosen. The silence of the farm deepened, not oppressive now, but expectant, as though the land itself waited for the dawn. Tobias knew the road ahead would be hard. He would face anger, ridicule, perhaps even hatred. The legacy of his family would crumble in the eyes of the community, but the sheriff would have his justice, however late, and Tobias would no longer be the keeper of a secret buried in shame. As he finally rose and carried the bundle to his room, he felt a strange calm settle over him, a clarity that came not from triumph, but from surrender. The truth would speak and the land would breathe again. And so the farm slept, the animals hushed, the stars bright, the earth holding its breath for the morning when silence would finally end. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't let it stop here. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next twist that will leave you speechless. Want more chilling tales and shocking discoveries? Click on the next video on your screen and dive straight into another story you won't forget. And don't keep this secret to yourself. Share this video with your friends and see whose side they choose. The truth deserves to be heard.